questions emerged. Oh, crikey. 4 of the main issues, bits of feedback that we've had, and talk through what we're going to do. So we had a really good chat with Martin Baker from the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Northamptonshire, who was really frank in a really helpful way. I mean, his first comment was, "I don't know how I can use this," and then we had a much longer conversation to really get to grips with what he found helpful and what he didn't find helpful and what was lacking. And like I said, I just wanted to kind of iterate that this is perfectly natural for me. No one's ever done anything like this before. This is the largest ever natural capital plan in the UK. So it's, I think, absolutely going to be something we figure out together rather than something that we can tell, entirely what we're going to produce right at the start of the process. And one of the main things that has been something I've intended for a while, but now it's become extremely clear to me, is that the main purpose of this plan is to inform the development of plans at other more local scales. And by that, I mean catchments, counties, and parishes. So I don't think anyone's going to particularly take this plan up and kind of implement it directly. Rather, someone working at, say, a catchment level scale is going to go, right, we want to do a bunch of stuff on our catchments. What should we be doing? What can we most usefully do that will contribute to biodiversity and nature across the wider region? And so basically, they can then pick up the outputs of this plan and go, all right, well, it suggests we can conserve this many hectares of wetland, we could restore this many hectares of riparian woodland to reduce flooding. And that'll then give them an indication of the local actions they can take that are of the most important regional significance, so how they can contribute to this wider ambition most effectively. So with that in mind, I see this as the primary function. So we're now going to be making sure that we design this so it helps empower and enable and support people at different scales, take the outputs of this work and apply it to their contexts. And as ever, I always say this, but I think it's a really important point to note, is that we're using the best available regional data, which is really good data. Julie's about to talk you through, it's very thorough, but it is also nationally available data. So there are going to be errors and inaccuracies, and quite a few people have pointed these out to us. So always, I think local knowledge needs to be used to interpret this stuff. It might be that we suggest something in a parish, and people who farm in that area go, well, that's a dumb idea. I think you should do this instead. And there's totally space for that. For me, that is a really important principle, that local knowledge should be used to interpret the results of this work. So NFU, who I have to thank, the NFU's feedback was really, really good, really detailed and really thorough. So I really appreciate that. And one of the issues that they raised was that water-related environmental issues should be addressed at the catchment scale. Now, those of you who can, I doubt anyone can, but we had a whole conversation about this in like October, I think, one of our first webinars. And I was talking about the fact that one of the first decisions you make in a spatial analysis like this is whether to use administrative boundaries like a parish or geographical boundaries like a catchment. And it's basically a trade-off. Geographical boundaries are better from a kind of biological perspective. They more accurately reflect nature, but administrative boundaries make implementation easier because that's often the scale at which decisions are made. And we went with parishes because they are, basically, we felt that was going to help implementation most effectively. However, Julia and Siso have been doing some thinking, and they reckon they can calculate the results for each catchment in the region. So they're going to go through and pull out, the recommended habitats and actions for each catchment, which is quite complex. There's quite a few challenges with the catchment data, but I think that's the best way of basically resolving this. So then you can choose over which one suits you better, catchments or parishes. Which brings me to the next big question that came up, which is, what does this mean for my area? I'm working at in this catchment or county or whatever. Help me understand better what this actually means. If I'm in a conserve zone or a store zone or both, what do I do with that? So the reason that we haven't shared the data so far, we've got readouts for all of this, but we haven't shared it because I was wanting to make sure that we didn't stumble into any unintended consequences. I think there are a lot of uses for this kind of data beyond what we'd originally imagined. And I wanted to make sure that we went into this with our eyes open and in a very confident and calm manner. But what we're going to do is we're going to release data, basically the outputs of the plan for every parish, catchment and county. So this will basically identify the actions recommended by the plan, grouped into the zones of restore, conserve and establish for each habitat and ecosystem service for each parish, catchment and county. So you'll be able to look in, all right, I'm in this parish, what does it recommend? And it'll suggest, you can conserve these habitats or these amount of hectares of these habitats, you can restore these amount of hectares of these habitats, and same for establish. And I think that will give the really detailed guidance that I think will make this immediately much more apparent what it actually means for the areas that people work at, which will be critical for people to give us, really effective feedback. If you look at that and those numbers seem wrong, that's, we'd really, really appreciate hearing about that. But then also, whilst this is the first iteration, that's the type of information that people have reflected back would be very useful for helping people develop plans at their local scales. So we're going to have the webinar on, I think, the 13th of July. I think Nancy tells me people are free from 3 to launch this service and explain how to use this evidence. And what we're going to do is release it under a Creative Commons license, which means if you're using it for non-commercial purposes, it's free. But if you have a commercial application, you're going to have a conversation with us and WRE to figure out how to make that work, basically. And then the last question that's come up kind of consistently through this, and again, the NFU phrased this very well in their feedback to us, which is basically how are we going to fund all this? And I think this is a critical question. And it kind of brings me to like one of the most important points, which is that for me, the main sort of action that's going to make this plan a reality is basically paying farmers a fair rate to maintain and restore nature. And I kind of feel like it's really important to highlight this because it's so critical, all this. I feel like the majority of these actions, the practice of it is going to be money gets put in the hands of farmers at a rate that they find acceptable and is viable from a business perspective to improve natural capital across Eastern England. And I kind of just want to highlight that because I think it's so critical to all of this, to note that that's going to be, paramount to the actions that underpin it. And to that end, the plan itself and the analysis that underpins it are being designed as a fundraising tool to help support these kinds of, to help deliver this end goal. And part of this, you kind of got to think from the perspective of someone operating at a regional level. So if you think about a private sector partner or private sector entity or DEFRA or someone trying to consider a biodiversity offset, what this plan will represent to them is some indication of where they can act across the region to get different kinds of outcomes like carbon storage or water purification or connectivity in the most cost-effective way. And the cost effectiveness is one of the kind of key kind of kickers here, because that helps you make a really solid business case that, look, if you're interested in clean water or climate resilience for your crops in your region, then actually these are the best places to act, not just for delivering the best outcomes, but to get the best return on your investment, basically, which is really critical to any good business case. So part of it is making the business case, but it's also about helping broker conversations. I see ultimately this as being one of the tools you can use to help start these conversations. If you have, all right, so you've got a large private company that's interested in reaching carbon neutrality. They've got a goal by 2030, say, and they're interested in carbon sequestration. Well, this will help them identify where they can act in order to sequester carbon, and then the plan can then help form the basis of conversations. They can approach catchment partnerships or counties or whatever it might be and go, look, this is what we're interested in doing. And you can then use the plan as a way of the means of kind of negotiating that project and that agreement. So this is obviously still fairly in the early stages, this kind of aspect of the project, but I see ensuring that this plan acts effectively as a tool for facilitating, supporting, and streamlining these conversations so that we get basically more money invested in nature through the hands of farmers as being one of the most important outcomes of this work. So this is something we're thinking a lot about. There'll be more on this particular topic later on down the line. But for now, I'm going to take quick questions and then I'm going to let Julia crack on with the main bulk of the talk, which is all of their fantastic detail and hard work. So I'll take a few quick questions if there are any. and then we'll go from there. Oh, amazing. So Simon Fisher has asked a question which I would have almost like, I feel like I could have planted that question because it's so good. So Simon has asked, so where does this fit in with the local nature recovery strategies and the Environment Bill? How will this be joined up? It looks like we're going to be swamped by plans. Yes, this is a good point. So the local nature recovery strategies are obviously the plans that counties will be developing for natural capital in their counties. And we actually use systematic conservation planning to support 3 of the 5 pilots that DEFRA have literally just completed. The way I see this interacting is it will help inform the target setting at the county level. Now, one of the main outcomes of the trials for us was that it's really hard to set targets. People found that to be the hardest part of the entire process, was figuring out, how much wetland or woodland or whatever should we have in our county? Where is an appropriate place to set the marker, the ambition of what we should achieve? Now, what this plan will do is help them understand these are the regionally significant actions you can take in your county. This is, the roughly the amount of wetlands or woodlands or whatever else, all these other important priority habitats and features of natural capital. This is roughly where we might want to set our ambition and where we might want to act. Of course, there are going to be local priorities which are different. For example, we haven't looked in any great detail at local access to nature, and that's one of the responsibilities of counties. So this is just a guidance, but this will help them understand where might they set their ambitions, and also how do they connect with their neighbours. One of the things that we also came up from this was that it's quite difficult when you're looking really internally in a county to look at all your boundaries and make sure that you're ensuring this connectivity that goes across the whole region is effectively planned. And that's exactly what this plan will help with. In terms of being swamped by plans, yeah, there are going to be a few. I'm not going to lie. I think the critical thing is knowing which plan is most appropriate to you. So ELMS, ELM, and DEFRA funding is likely to go through the LNRSs. That is one of their key purposes, in which case, if that's what you're interested in, that's what you should look to. If you're thinking about something different, like preserving water, increasing water quality across the region, you might use a combination of this plan and the LNRSs. Part of the thing is we don't really know how this is all going to plan out just yet, but I think there really is a key underpinning importance of ensuring that we have a really robust approach for developing these things that considers nature at the scale it operates at, which is at the regional and landscape scale. So thanks, Simon. That's really helpful. And Neil Jarvis has asked, paying farmers to restore nature will be the aim of the government's English land management scheme. How will the two work together? So I think this is an incredibly difficult question to ask because ELM is still quite in its infancy. They're still figuring out what it's going to look like. One of the main steers I've had is that the LNRSs are going to be critical to delivering it. So I see the LNRSs as being the piece that sort of ties this together. This plan informs the LNRSs, and then the LNRSs in turn will inform this future iterations of this plan. So I think that is something we'll have to answer when we get a bit further down the line and we know a bit more about ELM. Right, I'm going to shut up and let Julia take over. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Can you all see my slides?
Yeah, I can see it as well.
Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Julia Haywood, and I'm Biodiversified Spatial Planner. Also on the call is Dr. Cecilia Larrosa, and she's our Research and Development Lead. So we were told that some people would be interested in hearing more of the methodology in more detail. So we've put together this talk, and it will follow the process that you've all been a part of, and to show how your contributions have helped inform the spatial prioritization. So we'll start with a quick overview of the objectives and actions, as I know you've all seen these results a couple of times. We'll then move on to the targets and finally the spatial prioritization methods. So the first stage was determining what stakeholders wanted from or for nature, and this was termed the objectives, which are the natural capital outcomes wanted. The stakeholder input we received was enormous, with 945 submissions from 37 organisations. Examples of objectives included enhanced biodiversity, reduce flooding impact, protect peatlands for carbon storage, and improve water quality and flows. So we grouped our objectives into major natural capital categories, and the table here shows the number of times they were put forward, the number of stakeholders who put them forward. And there was a real emphasis on the biodiversity and ecosystem services, things like water quality, climate regulation, and flood control. So we tried to represent all of these objectives. However, unfortunately, this wasn't always possible. So the final column in this table shows whether these objectives could be included in the spatial prioritization or not. Cultural service was mainly to do with access to green space, which we hope to include in our next run. Water supply, biodiversity, which was specifically related to species, air quality, soil quality, and pollination, unfortunately couldn't be included in the prioritization, and this was due to lack of data. But just one thing to note, water supply is being addressed in other WRE work streams. So now we know what we want from nature, we need to know what actions we can do to deliver these objectives. So the stakeholders responded with 449 actions, again from 37 organizations. And these included things like conserve the best reed beds, restore functioning floodplains, plant trees along water courses, and encourage reduction in pesticides use. So the technical team took this information and grouped the actions into the relevant natural capital category. By doing this, it became very clear that actions related to habitats were the most frequent for not only biodiversity objectives, but also to deliver ecosystem service objectives. For example, planting trees to enhance biodiversity, but also planting trees in riparian areas to reduce flooding and improve water quality. So you can see from this table, the natural capital category, the actions were related to, the number of times it came up in the stakeholders' responses, and the number of stakeholders who put it forward. So in addition, it was evident that 4 key themes continually came up in the actions, and these were actions relating to conserving, restoring, and establishing habitats, as well as managing farmland. So for example, protecting traditional orchards, restoring fens, creating reed beds, and managing runoff. So this was really useful because one of the strengths of our spatial prioritization is that individual actions can be grouped into zones. So for example, the action we want to create new reed beds, we can fit this into an established zone. So we went on to group the 449 actions into these 4 zones. This table shows how often an action in these zones was put forward by the stakeholders and which natural capital category they were referring to. And this table really helps highlight how important biodiversity related actions were, as well as establishing new habitats to the WRE stakeholders, with 135 actions related to habitat establishment. So that was a really quick reminder of the objectives and actions. And now I'll go into more detail on how we use this information to feed into the spatial prioritization, starting with what data was needed to support these actions and in turn the objectives. So it's important to note that each of these actions have to have specific data representing it within each of these zones. So for example, spatial data that identifies where reed beds should be conserved, data on where reed beds could be restored, and data on where reed beds could be established. So I'm going to show you the data that we used in the prioritization split up by zone. And just to say, the managed zone was not included in this first run. So we're working on this to include in the second run. So I won't be showing any methods on the management zone today. So starting with the conserve zone, this had 2 data sources. The first identified where habitats should be conserved. It is important to note that actions specified by the stakeholders were from very specific to very broad. For example, conserve fens in a very specific location, all the way up to conserve all important habitats. So to ensure all habitats are represented across the WRE region, we use the Natural England Habitat Network Combined Maps, which is for all priority habitats. And from this, we extracted the individual primary habitats. So you can see that habitats that were included in this conserve zone on the table on the left. This small map represents the locations of conservable habitats across the WRE region. And this is a zoom in of this little red box, a zoom in of a couple of planning units, showing potential conservable habitats. So in this example, there's lowland fens, ancient woodland, lowland meadows, and also wood, pasture, and parkland. I want to add here that a stakeholder suggested that some habitats may not be well represented in the habitat network data, but may be better represented in the priority habitat inventory. So for the next run, we're also going to supplement the habitat networks with our priority habitat inventory data where habitats are being underrepresented. So the second data source that we used within the conserve zone was to show where habitats should be conserved that have high carbon storage value. So to do this, we used the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology carbon in vegetation data. And this shows the mean estimates of above ground carbon stocks. So basically the amount of carbon stored in vegetation across the WRE region. And this is in a 1 kilometre gridded resolution. So you can see that in the first figure. So from this, we calculated the mean tonne of carbon per hectare in each planning unit. From the habitat network primary habitats that I just showed you in the previous slide, we also calculated the total area in hectares of the conservable primary habitats in each planning unit. And finally, we multiplied these outputs, giving the tonnes of carbon present in each planning unit, weighted by the amount of conservable habitats. So to highlight here that within the conserve zone, the spatial prioritisation will identify planning units required to meet the targets for all these priority habitats, but it will also be prioritising the areas that will offer the highest carbon storage value. These datasets will be working together, finding synergies between these two datasets. They will not be competing with each other. So we also hope to include a carbon sequestration dataset in the next run to also help represent the climate regulation objectives. So moving on to the restore zone. So for the restore zone, we again use the Natural England Habitat Network maps to identify where habitats could be restored. And from this, we extracted the restorable habitats. Natural England defines these as primary habitats in a degraded or fragmented form, and which are likely suitable for habitat restoration. So same as before, the table on the left shows the habitats present in this zone. The map of WRE region shows the location of potential restorable habitats, and then again, a zoom in of a selection of planning units. So on to the established zone. The established zone was made up of 4 data sources. First, we used Natural England Habitat Network individual maps to identify where habitats could be established. And from this, we extracted the fragmentation action zone, which is the land that connects existing patches of primary and associated habitat, which are currently highly fragmented and where fragmentation could be reduced by habitat creation. And we also extracted the network enhancements zone 1, which Natural England defines as land suitable for creation of primary habitats. And the factors that are taken into consideration to ensure that area is suitable includes things like proximity to primary habitat, land use, soil type, slope, and also proximity to coast. So again, on the left, you can see the habitats included in the established zone, the WRE region of the locations of establishable habitats, and then again, a zoom in of potential habitats in a couple of planning units. So the next 2 data sets that we used in the established zone identified where habitats could be created that would have flood mitigation benefits, as well as supporting other objectives like water quality and biodiversity. So this data was available from the Working with Natural Processes and included riparian woodland potential, which you can see has a really huge distribution, and then also floodplain reconnection potential. The final data set included in the established zone was to identify areas where water quality needs to be improved. And this could either be via establishing new habitats, such as wetlands and riparian woodland, but also to do with the more general management category. So identifying areas where changes in, for example, fertilizer use or runoff could be implemented to help improve water quality. So to do this, we use data on sensitive rivers and lakes to nutrient loads from the Environmental Agency. And we also had catchment data known as integrated hydrological units from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So from this, we identified the catchments supplying these sensitive water environments so that the analysis can prioritise these areas for water quality improvements. Another change that we could do for the next run is to switch from the IHU catchments to the catchment abstraction management strategies. So if anyone has any suggestions on which of those two data sets might better represent our information, then please let us know. And again, the 4 data sets contributing to the established zone will all be working together to find synergies, not competing with each other. So here are all the individual aspects of data that I just went through, split into the 3 zones. And we call each of these conservation features, of which there are 43. Each of the conservation features will have its own target set. Each will be prioritized for in the analysis, with synergies trying to be found within all of the zones. So there are limitations and assumptions relating to all of this data. For example, as it stands, each of the habitats we have in our established zone have the same likelihood of succeeding, which in practice is really unlikely. Another example is for the water quality conservation feature. This suggests any actions in these catchments will have a positive impact on water quality, which again will likely vary in practice. So our plan is to include a table of these assumptions and limitations in our final report. So at a specific location, multiple actions can't be conducted on the ground. And so some of the habitat data I just showed you, specifically restore and establish zones, required some additional data processing. And this is because there's overlaps in the data, both between these 2 zones, as well as within these zones. So to start, all conservation feature data were clipped to the previous zones. And this was because it was assumed that conserving existing priority habitat was more desirable than restoring and establishing potential habitats. And restoring potential habitats was again more desirable than establishing new habitats. So for example, if in a specific area there may be lowland fens that could be conserved, there may also be the potential to establish reed beds in that exact same area. To deal with this overlap, we removed the area of potential establishable reed beds for the more desirable action of protecting the existing lowland fens. So within the restore and establish zone, habitats also overlapped. And we asked the stakeholders, where we have a choice about which habitat to use, how should we rank these habitats? So stakeholders ranked the habitats in order of preference, with orange representing high and blue representing low. We also calculated the total areas of these potential habitats in the WRE region and took this into account in the final rank. So for example, stakeholders put purple moorgrass as the lowest rank. However, we found this habitat had a really small area where it could be restored and established. So if those overlaps were removed, then actually no purple moorgrass could be restored or established. And therefore we bumped habitats like this up the rank, and finally habitat overlaps were removed in order of this final ranking. Also, for the established zone, other further clips are required. So the riparian woodland potential dataset had a really vast distribution, and therefore that was clipped to the floodplain reconnection potential and also the habitat network priority habitats. And then again, the floodplain reconnection potential was then clipped by the priority habitats. So now we have collated all the data sets required to support the objectives and actions. Targets need to be set to indicate the amount of natural capital that you want. So targets a quantified description of the actions and objectives. For example, restore 50 hectares of wetland and plant 2,000 hectares of trees in riparian areas. So we asked you to fill out a questionnaire about your views on targets, and we received largely unanimous responses from a total of 26 organizations, which was that some habitats are more important than others, and that targets should be set high. So the targets, where possible, were based on policy. Within the conserved zone, the priority habitats had targets set at 80%. So this is 80% of their area will be met within the prioritization. Carbon storage was set as 90%, as this has to be higher than the priority habitat target. So higher carbon value planning units are prioritized for. Within the restore zone, priority habitats had targets set at 75%, and this was based on the 25-year environmental plan. For the priority habitats in the established zone, 500,000 hectares of habitat should be established in England based on the 25-year environmental plan. And that is equivalent to 115 hectares in the WRE region, and this value is split proportionally between the priority habitats. The 25-year plan also states that 12% of England should be covered in woodland. So to reach this goal, an additional 225,000 hectares of woodland needs to be created in the WRE region. And this was split proportionally between riparian woodland and floodplain connection potential. So this target, however, needs reworking. Firstly, it would be better for us to use the floodplain reconnection woodland potential datasets. And secondly, deciduous woodland, which isn't in the habitat network data, needs to be taken into account when calculating this target, as it's likely a lot less woodland needs to be established to meet a 12% target. Finally, to be consistent with carbon storage, the target for water quality was set at 90%. So I know you guys have seen this table before. So it shows the conservation features, the potential amount of each conservation feature in the WRE region split by the 3 zones, and finally the targets that were set for it. So there's just the numerical values. So those are all the conservation features that were included in the analysis, as well as the targets. And next I will show additional data that was needed to run the prioritization. So designated sites were considered areas where active conservation is already undertaken, and therefore these areas should be locked in, meaning that they're always selected for in the prioritization. So we locked these designated sites in just for the conserve zone, because technically restoring and establishing actions can still be implemented in those designated sites. Designated sites were created from sites of special scientific interest, local nature reserves, and also national nature reserves. And this selection was based on the relevant literature in this field. Planning units, which I have already referred to. So these are small subsections of the WRE region that the prioritization works with. So it was decided that parish was used as this is an administrative boundary, which would help actions be implemented on the ground. Some parishes had areas that were already designated for nature and areas that were not. So to ensure this detail was taken into consideration in the prioritization, these parishes were actually split into either designated or not, and therefore one parish may become 2 planning units. And this basically enables the non-designated part to be prioritized for. Finally, exclusion zones. So these were considered areas that land management change cannot occur, and therefore should be excluded from the prioritization. Exclusion zones were identified as the urban category from the agricultural land classification grade, the urban category from the land cover map, and network enhancement zone 2 category from Natural England habitat network maps, which are areas considered unsuitable for habitats. So the spatial prioritization optimizes the benefits of natural capital action against cost. Essentially, how do you get the most natural capital benefit for the lowest cost? So this total cost is calculated from 2 parts. The opportunity cost is the foregone income if the current land management use is changed, and this is spatially explicit. And then there's the action cost, which is the average fixed cost of applying these natural capital actions, and this is not spatially explicit. So for each planning unit, we estimate the monetary cost of implementing each individual action. Then the total cost of each planning unit is calculated as the sum of all those individual costs. So this is the cost equation for each individual action. And it is made up of R, which is the farmland opportunity cost for that specific planning unit, Z, which is the cost of applying the specific action. And these are then both multiplied by A, which is the area of conservation feature in the planning unit relating to the specific action. So how do we get to those numbers? So R, this is the farmland opportunity cost for a specific planning unit. And this is calculated from P, which is the average price of farmland in the planning unit. And this is the spatially explicit aspect of the cost. And this is then multiplied by this social discount rate, which is 3.5%, and the time to completion, which we set to 30 years to align with the environmental plan. Then you've got Z. So Z is the action cost, and this is the cost of applying the natural capital action. So for conserve action, this was set as 0, as it's assumed conserving habitats requires no additional cost, although of course in practice there are other things like maintenance cost. The average cost in England to restore habitats in unfavourable condition per year over a 10-year period is £1,856 per hectare, and this is based on literature. And the average cost in England to create new habitat per hectare over a 10-year period is £3,403 per hectare. So the next slide is going to show how we created this spatially explicit average price of farmland. So 3 data sources were used for this. Land cover map, which identifies the farmland type as either pasture or arable. The agricultural land classification, which identifies the grade of land, and this is from poor all the way through to prime. And finally, Farmers Weekly average farmland prices, which is categorized by those farmland types, by those grades, and then also by county. So within a planning unit, each of these land parcels, so those specific farmland types and grades, were multiplied by the average farmland prices, and then these were summed for each planning unit. Price per hectare was then calculated for each planning unit. So just to point out here, there is a limitation to this cost data set, as it does exclude things like administrative costs and also willingness to participate. So we now have all the information needed to run the spatial prioritization. All of this data, including the conservation features and the cost, are all processed at the planning unit level. So each planning unit, we have the area of each conservation feature present and the associated cost of that planning unit. And this is what the prioritization software works with. So we use the software Marksan to do this prioritization, which is a decision support tool. So this is a free open access software. The goal of the spatial prioritization is to identify priority planning units for action. So what planning units are needed to meet all the targets at the lowest cost. So to do this, Marksan starts by picking a selection of planning units at random. It will then pick another planning unit at random and determine whether including it as a priority will help cost effectively deliver those targets. If it does, then Marksan keeps this and includes it in the priority. It will then select another planning unit. If this does not cost effectively deliver the targets, then the planning unit is excluded. So we set Marksan to have 100 million iterations, and this gives the software enough space to analyze a huge combination of planning units, which will eventually create a final solution, which will enable all targets to be met, and again at the lowest cost. So this is one really, really good solution. However, we then again set Marksan to repeat that process 100 times. And therefore we ended up with 100 really good solutions that met all the targets and were cost effective. So that analysis allows us to produce 2 outputs. The first is called the best solution, but really it should be called the best of the best, because this is the solution out of those 100 runs that has the lowest cost. But remember, all of those 100 solutions are really, really good. So on the right, you can see the best solution that we had for our conserve zone. So this is showing the planning units in yellow as those that are prioritized for to meet the targets for all of those conservation features. So the second output is called the selection frequency, and this represents the irreplaceability of each planning unit to meet the targets at the lowest cost. So the selection frequency tells us how many times out of those 100 runs was each planning unit prioritized for. So if the value is 0, it means that the planning unit was never selected for. Perhaps it has no conservation features present in it, which means Marksan would just always exclude it. So therefore, this planning unit is never needed to meet the targets. If the selection frequency is 100, however, this tells us that the planning unit is needed every single time to meet one, but all the way up to multiple targets. So if this planning unit was removed from the analysis, those targets will not be able to be met. So this planning unit is really important and cannot be replaced. So again, this is an example from the conserve zone with selection frequency values running from 0 to 100. And it shows how irreplaceable each planning unit is. Bearing in mind some of these black areas, so the 100 selection frequencies are in fact those designated sites that were locked in. So these will always be 100 in the conserve zone, but they weren't locked in for the restore and establish. So what I just described would have been run for each individual zone. So the first for conserve is prioritizing all of those conserve conservation features, providing us with the best solution and a selection frequency. And then it was run again for the restore conservation features, providing the best solution and selection frequency, and then again for establish. So we chose to do it this way so that a planning unit can be assigned to multiple zones, so multiple actions can be undertook in a planning unit. And the final output identifies areas of regional priority. And for this, we overlaid the best solutions from those 3 zones. And as you can see, planning units could be assigned to multiple zones. So the planning units assigned to multiple zones are those in the green, and then also to single zones, so conserve, restore, and establish. So as Sam said, we have made other outputs for you, but the plan is to go through those final maps again, and also those new outputs, I think, in the next workshop. So thank you so much for listening, and myself and Siso would happily take any questions and also any suggestions for improving it or changing it or anything like that.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Julia. That's fantastic.
You're
welcome. So we've got a long list of questions, and we'll, please keep typing them in, and we'll go through them one by one. I think I'll answer one now it's an easy one that I know the answer to give Julia a chance to catch her breath. Tim Papworth has asked, what is the definition of ancient woodland? Because you cannot establish or restore this. The key is in the word ancient. So yeah, you're spot on. So this has come up before. This is because the Natural England definition in that habitat category actually refers not just to ancient trees, but also to the species assemblages. I think there are some rules about not creating technically ancient woodland kind of in isolation. Rather, it needs to be near existing actual ancient woodland, so almost like a sort of ancient woodland buffer. So that's why there's a small amount of potential for restore and establish, because it's same species assemblages. So it's a slightly kind of nitpicky data question. I guess I'll go through the questions in order. Robin has asked, hi Julia and Sam, it might be worth explaining why water supply wasn't included due to lack of data. May seem odd to some given you're doing this work with WRE. Julia, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so one of the limitations of the data that we need for the spatial prioritization is it needs to be a resolution across the whole WRE region. And most of the water quality data that we could get our hands on were point sampling data. So it wasn't truly representing water, so both supply and water quality across the whole region. It was just really specific locations. And that would have then biased those locations for the prioritization rather than actually working out the best place to do this across the WRE region. But yes, if anyone has any water quality or water supply data, that would be highly appreciated.
Yeah, as a general rule, Julia and Siso are super keen to get their hands on more data. So if it exists, they've normally found it and excluded it. So if it's not included, they normally have an incredibly specific reason as to why not. And on that topic, Philip Pearson has asked, well, he said, interesting to hear that there isn't enough data to focus on species. Are there key flagship species which could be considered? What does the data gap look like? And is this something that could be addressed in time? Julia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so again, this is pretty much the same concept as the water quality stuff. So a lot of the species data that we have is again quite pocketed and quite specific for specific locations rather than representing the whole WRE region. Ideally, we would have things like modeled distribution of specific species, but either that data wasn't available or it was licensed. So again, any information on species would be really important. There's a load of other reasons why we kind of ruled out species, mainly because which species do you pick? And we know there's a big debate about this. I think Natural England are hoping to create a list of priority species, which would be really useful. And again, we could then use that data within this. But those are the main reasons. Siso might have some other ones to add, but yeah, basically we need it to be represented across the WRE region, and also we don't want to bias against certain species. And also normally most of the habitats will help represent the species as well. They kind of act as a representative of the species.
Awesome, thank you. So we actually have a similar question again. There's a lot of data questions here from Simon Fisher of the NFU again. So he said, thanks, Julia. as you use an area of North Ants, the area you zoomed into, have you compared the spatial priorities you've developed with the North Ants habitat opportunity mapping that's been compared over the last 12 months? And I think I know the basic answer to this is, again, we have to use data that's consistent across the region. However, we'd be very interested to hear the opinions of stakeholders in that area if they look at those maps and they look at these maps and they feel that there are things that are missed or opportunities that are missed. I actually had a quick look because that question came up halfway through. So I found the report and I've been looking at it while Julia's been speaking. And I think that a lot of the methods we used, you draw from a lot of the same underlying data sources. So in many cases, the opportunity maps that the opportunities they're identifying are included in our methods. But don't hold me to that. I'll have to get Julia to answer that more confidently after the session.
No, Sam's brought up a really good point. So you want to make sure you're not duplicating the data sources that you're using. So a lot of the opportunity maps that have been created, say on a county level, these at some point might have used the kind of raw habitat network data or priority habitat data, in which case we're kind of duplicating it, and therefore you're biasing the results towards those data that have been duplicated.
Awesome, thanks. Joe Copplestone has said Broadland region alone has to provide 30,000 housing units by 2035. Areas have already been prioritised where this may happen. Is this data being taken into account to establish a true picture of what habitat is impacted? In a word, no. This is why we now have this review process, because now we're going to actually send out the detailed data for each parish and county and all that kind of stuff. So we'd really hope that people who are working in that area would be able to have a look at this, and if it clashes horribly with their plans, we'd love to know about it. I mean, part of it is if they can tell us specific details, and stop me if I'm speaking out of turn here, Julia, but if they can give us specific details, we might be able to include that in the analysis. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So any areas that absolutely cannot be included in the prioritization, then yeah, we can exclude them. Ideally, we would have a beautiful data layer that represents where counties are planning to build houses, and we could include that, but sadly it doesn't work like that.
Not yet, no. Well, and this actually also draws to a really important point, which is that we're doing some work with systematic conservation planning elsewhere with WRE to use the outputs of county level plans to inform development. So we're thinking very hard about how to use the outputs of these kinds of projects to inform things like housing development choices. That's one of the kind of key uses we see for this kind of work. Archie Ruggles-Bryce, who's actually been a panelist on these sessions before, so thank you, Archie, for coming back again. On the land opportunity cost, is the per hectare rate annual or capitalised over 30 years? Julia, do you want to?
I'll take this one.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Siso.
So no, so we've just calculated the annual rate from the price of land, and then added up for the 30 years. We haven't done anything else like considering a variable discount rate or variable income basically in those years. So I am happy to have a conversation about this if we can improve it.
Thank you, Siso. So I will highlight that the cost layer is one of Siso's main concerns. This is representing the farm community effectiveness has formed the basis of quite a lot of meetings and discussions. So yeah, any thoughts on that? Definitely get in touch with Siso.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So Charitos has got a question, which interesting enough, we were talking about just the other day. Carbon storage on the features table was only shown under the conserve column and not under restore or establish. Does this mean that enhancing carbon storage is not an explicit goal of restoring or establishing new habitats? And would any gain from restoration or establishment be incorporated into spatial modelling? Who would like to take that one?
I can take that one as well. So getting the only data that we could get in terms, say, spatially explicit, that would cover the whole region in terms of quantifying how much you would sequester by creating or restoring habitat, not for restore, but for creating habitat, had to do with woodland. I know that Natural England has just released last month, the month before, I'm not remember, a full report linking carbon sequestration rates with different habitat types. And so that we could potentially link the creation of habitat with carbon sequestration. But there are quite a few decisions because the habitat types they use do not directly correspond with the habitat types defined by the other spatial layers. So this is something that we've been discussing to include, but haven't figured out yet which is the best way to do it.
Awesome, thank you, Siso. And I kind of just wanted to highlight as well that, you know, we are in iteration 1 of this. So there's a lot of things that this has brought up, you know, like the habitat inventory data, for example, and the carbon issue that are issues that are ongoing. And I think I really want to highlight that our approach with this is to try and be open when we're still figuring it out, because we appreciate that there's a lot of extremely high levels of expertise in the audience. So we're very keen to kind of work with you where you have answers to these things, to make sure we do it as, you know, make it as good as it can be, really. Philip has a question, which is, with respect to designated sites, will there be a conservation objectives and supplementary conservation advice which may identify restore targets? Has this been addressed in the process?
Correct me if I'm not answering the question. So yeah, within our designated sites, we'll be able to, so those kind of outputs that we'll show in the next workshop, you'll be able to see the conservation features present in those designated sites, and whether they've been prioritized for for restoring and establish, because designated sites were not locked in for the restore and establish zone. So there will be actions prioritized in those regions. I don't know, is that answer to that question?
So I think they are mentioning that there might be targets to restore within the designated site. So it might be worth, if we can get a hand on those, to just see if our prioritization is, how far is it from meeting those targets or not.
Right, okay. Yeah, that sounds super useful. Thank you, Philip. And obviously Siso and Julia. Awesome, okay. Well, that sounds like something to look into then. Charlotte Hounsell has asked, if you have wholly excluded planning units, does this mean there is no conserve, restore, or establish data for this because they're excluded? So do you want to take this question, and then I actually have some thoughts on this, but I'll speak after you.
Yeah.
I don't think, have we fully excluded, I don't think we have fully excluded any planning unit, because there was some either pasture or arable land everywhere.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question. So we, very early in the process, we discussed potentially including kind of urban greening and as a type of action, as a zone, but quickly realized that that would be a plan in itself and not so much a zone in this wider plan.
Yes, that actually raises literally the topic I want to talk about, which is we've had quite a few conversations with various people about the importance of urban green space and the potential for using systematic conservation planning at that scale within this, you know, really zooming right in. I think this is super important, and I think it's really interesting. And as it happens, Daisy, our graduate consultant, wrote her thesis on this topic, so it's something that we're quite passionate about as a team. I think it's definitely something that's going to need to be explored a lot more. It's a busy space already, but I personally would love to see those kinds of plans included in this kind of regional vision. But I think it's going to need quite a nuanced approach, and you know, the right kind of authority to lead it, essentially.
So something that I want to add related to this is that we do want to include access to green space in the next iteration, and that might integrate urban areas better.
Awesome, thank you, Siso. So Majid has asked, apologies if I've pronounced that incorrectly, has asked, if I'm not wrong, your cost-benefit optimization, you included monetizable cost and benefit elements. How about non-monetizable elements, such as customers or farmer satisfaction?
Yes,
So
this is.
yes, you're correct. Yeah, basically.
Go
Sorry,
ahead,
on,
Sam. Go ahead.
No, you're. This is.
No, I was
you're
just
the
going to say
expert.
that this is right on the spot. Is just the monetizable costs, and this is what Julia mentioned as a big caveat: is that we're not accounting for, you call it farmer satisfaction or customer satisfaction here, or we were thinking about farmers' willingness to participate in this kind of initiative, which it can make or break the implementation. So it is a big gap, but that would require a study in itself to get that type of information. Or I'm happy to discuss with any group interested, kind of see how we can address it.
Thank you. And this is just to kind of highlight the importance of this topic. One of the counties that we were working with as part of the DEFRA LNRS trials actually highlighted this as one of the kind of next steps they'd be most interested in. So you're not alone in thinking that. This is a really important issue. And fascinatingly, this is actually one that the kind of global community of SCP is in the middle of discussing and trying to figure out. Well, they have been for some time, but I guess it's a globally relevant SCP topic. Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to do that. And I also think it's important to note this is partly why we picked a planning unit, so parishes, which was not too specific, because we didn't want to be producing a plan that sort of was saying, right, this farmer here should be doing this, because that's not appropriate. And it very much jumps the gun on this kind of, on the agency and, the right of a farmer to decide what happens on their land. So that kind of leaving some significant wiggle room in there so that people at the local level can develop a plan that is suitable for what they want to do and for the area is kind of a slightly roundabout way of addressing the fact that that is a key issue. We've got a question from A.W. Alston here. Many of the selected sites have been in various environmental schemes for 30 to 40 years. Why do you think restoring them again is going to be successful this time, training for land managers to hit new targets?
Another big question, I think, which we also kind of mentioned.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry, there seems to be a slight delay. So
I'm sorry. I was meant to have new internet installed today, and I'm instead using it off my phone. So I'm very glad it's holding up, but it does mean there's a slight delay. So I think one of the interesting, because this is a question that comes up quite often, which is that we've, essentially variations of the same theme, but we've seen this sort of thing before. Why is it going to be different this time? And I think what I would suggest is that in the last few years, there has been a massive shift in the way people think about nature, natural capital, and biodiversity. I mean, to be entirely frank, I'm not sure our company, Biodiversify, would have been successful 5-10 years ago, because I'm not sure that there was such public interest in it. And now you've got suddenly, the LNRSs are a big public agenda item. There's, carbon projects going on. There's carbon sequestration through natural capital solutions, left, right, and centre. Natural capital investment, so people queuing up to invest large amounts of money into nature restoration is a massive topic. And fascinatingly, the bottleneck is not availability of money. The bottleneck is the ability to effectively plan for it at scale. So I think that we're in the middle of a very interesting period because there's suddenly attention and money available for this kind of project, which has never been there before. And now suddenly there's so much interest in this. So I think that, obviously, let's not, you raise a really important point. Let's not assume that we're not going to blunder into the same pitfalls that have come before. Let's think carefully about this and approach it sensibly. But I think also this is a slightly different period. This is a slightly unusual period of time. And I think, part of what we're doing is taking advantage of that. Emma Taylor has said here, from an ALEP perspective, the interface between your data and housing growth projections is important. Robin now has growth links into planning colleagues at NCC, which is Norfolk County Council. But if you need help talking to the right people to work out how to overlay local plan development areas with your work, then let me know. So yes, Emma, that would be amazing. Thank you very much. That would be fantastic. Awesome. So we appear to have come to the end of our questions of the day. Has anyone got anything else that's...
Sam, there is just one more from Neil, if you scroll up on the chat.
Oh, I answered that one already.
Oh, did you? Sorry.
That was
great. No question unanswered.
No. Amazing. So I think that's probably it for today then, if there are no more questions. As always, this is meant to be a very open process, and we're trying to talk to you about the problems and the challenges and the opportunities as they emerge. So the next steps will be creating a system for people to download the data. Again, like I said, it'll be done through a Creative Commons license, so you'll be able to get the results for every parish, hopefully catchment and county in Eastern England. So for each of the zones, it'll tell you the number of hectares for all the different habitats. We're going to have to create something online to do that, so that people can download it for non-commercial use. That's not to say people can't use it for commercial use, but it will require a conversation, as we're still figuring out exactly what that would mean and what that would look like. So if you have a commercial thought, then please do just get in touch. Let's have a chat. That'll be on the 13th of July. So what we'll do is have Siso and Julia talk through exactly what the data is, how to interact with it and how to use it. And I think a key part of that is we're going to give you the shape files. So anyone who is GIS savvy can download this and open it up in GIS, and they'll be able to have an interactive map where you can click on any individual parish and it'll tell you the readout of what you can do where, which to my eyes is magic as a social scientist, but as the sort of thing that Julia and Siso work on a daily basis. It's I think it's all fantastic. It's very cool. You can literally just click on the bit you're interested in and it'll give you a readout of all the different habitats. So what we'll be doing over the next few weeks is basically adapting that from what they've created so far into something that's much more easy to access and creating some kind of guidelines on how to use it. Yeah, Darren Tansley has said shape files will be very useful for us. Yeah, so I think there's going to be a few different audiences for this. Like my real hope is that there's a lot of GIS experts in the county councils and the various different organisations, and my hope is that we can provide those experts with the tools they need to properly engage with this and figure out what it means for their organisation or their team. I appreciate there's going to be different entry points for different people. Some people are going to want something, people like me are going to want something similar to understand, whereas people with a strong technical background are, might have quite specific questions they wish to ask of the data and the information. So again, this is going to be something that we're going to rely on your feedback for, both for the targets themselves, but also how we can make sure that the outputs are useful. It may well be that in the end, the main kind of users of this are the technical specialists within the planning teams, in which case we might target them directly, potentially even have some kind of side conversations with GIS specialists to figure out how to make it most applicable. I don't want to promise anything too much just yet, Julia and Siso. Awesome. Well, just check questions. Please make, Simon Fisher has said, please make the data maps very accessible. GISs might be cool, but others might have to have simple access and not IT complicated to frustrate others. Yeah, I 100% agree. So there's going to be Excel spreadsheets, so you can access it in a really, most people can use Excel. There'll be GIS layers for your techie folk, but then there'll also be maps that are more, other ones. There's already a map pack up on the WRE website, so you can download all the outputs we've produced so far, but if there are other tools or decision support things that we have to produce, then yeah, let's keep the conversation going, basically. Awesome. All right, well, thank you very much in that case, and we'll look forward to seeing you in July. Have a great day, folks.